I'm Derrick Jensen. This is Resistance Radio on the Regressive Radio Network. My guest today is Four Arrows' Wahinkpe Topa, whose Anglo name is Donald Trent Jacobs. He's a professor at Fielding Graduate University and formerly the Dean of Education at Oglala Lakota University on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. He was selected by the Alternative Education Resource Organization as one of 27 visionaries in education. He won Martin Springer Institute Moral Courage Award for his activism and has been involved in creating the first marine no-take zone on the Pacific coast of Mexico. He's an American Indian activist and author of 21 books and numerous articles and chapters about indigenous worldview applications to contemporary world issues. His most recent book is Point of Departure, Returning to a More Authentic Worldview for Education and Survival. So first off, thank you for all of your great work over the years, over the decades, and thank you for this book, and thank you for being on the program.
Well, Derrick, the sentiment is mutual. I continue to honor the work that you're doing and that a number of people are doing that maybe will help us rebuild, if not prevent.
Well, thank you. So the first question I would like to ask is that you contend in this book that there are really only two worldviews, not a million. There are two worldviews. Can you talk about that?
Well, I sure will. It's a good basic foundation for the book because it's very controversial, even in the academy, where worldviews are used to refer to religions, ideologies, cultures. But there's a growing body of scholarship. For example, a recent dissertation from the University of Amsterdam, saying a worldview is a concept whose time has come. And that it does not incorporate religions, it does not incorporate cultures, it is not about ideologies or beliefs, that these things are all subsumed in this water in which we swim. That's kind of how I like to think of it. It's such a deep concept that it goes deeper than these ideologies or paradigms or religions. And with more and more people talking about that, I found that a scholar from the University of Chicago, who was the first social anthropologist, actually, Robert Redfield, he led worldview studies at the University of Chicago. And he actually also said that there was only two. He actually said there was three initially. There was the Oriental one. But he said largely, and this is in the 50s, that the Oriental one had been largely subsumed under what he refers as to the dominant one, which is, stems from Greco-Roman heritage and a little bit beyond. I have the same kind of theory, of which we can never prove, that it was about 8,000 years ago where all this started to happen. But so this idea of two worldviews, it actually shows up not just in scholarship, but Johns Hopkins University's New School of Education says that worldview reflection is one of the most important things that we can do. They don't necessarily identify just the two, but if we can begin to get to the core of what is problematic that's causing the destruction of every life system, possibly or probably being in a sixth mass extinction, with such worldview assumptions as what your new book is about, the idea that there's this myth of human supremacy. Things that, some of the most progressive, if you will, left-wing activists with the greatest hearts trying to bring solidarity and stop racism and hate crimes, all this stuff, at some level, that worldview of hierarchy still exists. And that's what I try to do in this book, is I try to have a very practical way on how we can reflect on worldview in a way that actually can transform via what I call trance-based learning, which is why we're, no matter how intelligent we get, we just can't seem to break past the worldview, because it's really only able to happen when we use trance-based learning, as our ancestors did for 99% of human history.
So I want to dive into the trance-based learning a bit more, but I want to back you up a little bit. And so my understanding of what you're saying is that you can have a culture, you can have a religion, but a worldview would be like the step that is even deeper than the direct cultural manifestation. Is this the first step of what you're saying? So,
exactly. For example, under indigenous worldview, which is a pan-Indian generalization of common themes that most indigenous cultures, and I've lived with and I've studied many, have in common. And under them are thousands of very distinctively different cultures. And there's a slippery slope here, Derrick, because one of the things that really identifies indigenous worldview is those distinctive indigenous cultures to place. So I always have to be really careful. The idea of an indigenous worldview that doesn't also include knowledge of place and sacredness of place begins to miss the mark. But nonetheless, the worldview is what we have to start with. Then we're going to have to go back to local places and create our own indigenous tribal cultures based on the flora and fauna and the animals and the kind of place we're in. So under a worldview, these are the deeper ones, like the one I just mentioned that your book is about, this anthropocentric problem. But non-hierarchical on many levels. Indigenous cultures, even the Pacific Islands where they had kings and queens, where they were reverse dominant hierarchies. So they were really non-hierarchical. Language was non-categorical. Most of the language was verb-based, and I'm not saying that we can change our European languages to do that, but we can work harder at avoiding categories like that we use when we identify and label children and others. Ideas about courage. The idea that generosity is the highest expression of courage is not something in our worldview. But I'll never forget being on the Pine Ridge Reservation many years ago where I lived, and I went with Alex Whiteplume with his little girl to a gentleman whose wife had died. And the little girl was maybe 9 years old, had a puppy, and just loved it, and just had gotten it. And, they're in poverty, and the puppy was a big deal. And when they got there, the little girl saw the pain that this girl that had just lost her mother was in and gave her puppy away. Now, that took a lot of courage, but it was an act of generosity. And if you study, you get beyond the educational hegemony and anti-indianism that we've been inundated with in scholarship and in movies and in media, you really find that this culture of generosity was a worldview that all these different cultures practice. So I could go on. There's a whole, and I talk about a number of them, fluid boundaries, this idea of complementarity, which also brings kind of an interesting slippery slope, because oftentimes I'm accused, well, so wait a minute, if you believe that a worldview precept of indigenous worldview is seeking complementarity, how can you be polarizing the dominant worldview with the indigenous worldview? And that's something maybe we can talk about later, and how I can rationalize that. So so that's kind of this idea, and when you look at so many scholars that are just talking about things, I mean, Noam Chomsky even is comparing the indigenous worldview with non-indigenous worldview. People today are saying, you know what, there is this duality that has gotten us in trouble, and we've got a lot to learn from those few remaining peoples who have not been colonized and Christianized, etc. So this idea of two worldviews is quite a new idea, really.
So, excuse me, to just hammer this, I want to make sure it's 100% clear. So I live on Tolowa land in far northern California, and there's a salmon-based culture. And obviously the culture here would be different than the culture down where you are currently living in Mexico. And that would be an entirely different... There aren't salmon there, so they wouldn't be a salmon-based culture. They would be whoever... I don't know who they'd be for their culture. But what you're saying is underlying, those would be... I don't want to say superficial, but those would be the place-based aspects of this different worldview of generosity would be the difference between... Some of the differences between the Tolowa and whomever land you're on right now. Is that right?
Exactly. Their sacred ideas about the salmon as fellow brothers and sisters, and as interconnected, and as teachers. Okay, that comes from the worldview. It just happens there, it's salmon, whereas here, where I'm at right now, on the far west coast of Vancouver Island, it's black bear. And so so it's in British Columbia. It's interesting. There are more languages in British Columbia than in any other place on Earth. And the reason is that the geography is that much diverse. And each place where the geography and the animal life and the trees change significantly, there's a different language, because language originated as a way to understand place. Now, so that's where the individual importance of cultures are, and of course we're killing most of them, and we have lost that idea. But underlying that is this deeper water that we swim in, and that is the idea of place-based sacredness to begin with.
And that perspective has, as you've said, that perspective is one that has guided humans for nearly all of their history. So can you mention that briefly, and then also be explicit about what you mean by the dominant worldview?
Well, the 99% is what Darcy and Navarez, we're putting on a huge conference at the University of Notre Dame next month called On Indigenous Wisdom for Sustainability, and she's done a lot of work on this. And so when we're talking about this dominant culture, we really don't know exactly. I mean, we can look at different studies, and I think you and I have both done this. My theory is it started maybe, let's assume, here's kind of my story. A couple of indigenous people, let's say one woman and one man, to keep the authentic balance. I say that because a book just came out, it's a New York Times bestseller called The Heart of Everything That Is, that every single book reviewer in the country, from the New York Times to the San Francisco Chronicle, said it was the most honest book on indigenous Lakota people ever on Red Cloud. And I wrote on truth out of just a blast of it, because it wasn't, So these ideas started somewhere where, let's say this man and woman, they did agriculture. The agricultural was going on forever. We know that. We know that gatherer-hunters, which I prefer to the hunter-gatherer phrase, gatherer-hunters did plants and gardens for as long as we can go back. But it doesn't seem that there was ever done in a way that there was surplus. So let's say there was this surplus, and because greed and the lust for power, that's built into all people. That's why indigenous stories of the tricksters, warn us about that, and that's why we use the trance-based learning to try to stay on the proper path. We're always getting sucked into that. But let's say they didn't handle it. That the power was so strong, they had all this surplus, so they began this hierarchy, this new system of economics. That's someplace in around where Turkey is. That's also not coincidental where European foundational languages came. So, my theory, and it's far from being proven, my theory is that it's not a coincidence that a more materialistic language, the language of English, for example, that is predominating in our world today, that really is about hierarchy. It's about categorization. It's a very noun-based language that replaced the more verb-based, moving in motion kinds of language, and and the mysterious thing, and it supported this new thing, and that continued up until today. So again, maybe it's not an academic argument, but I use it as a way to kind of understand how the new world came about, the worldview came about.
And the worldview in a nutshell, the dominant worldview in a nutshell is, as opposed to generosity, it is. So what is the dominant worldview in your perspective?
Well, Well, just for example, I had mentioned, I wrote a list on a piece of paper at the workshop yesterday. I can read you where I talk about hierarchical worldview, categorical language. We're going to talk about the 4 parts of my book: trans-based learning not being used, a different orientation to fear, a different orientation to authority, a different orientation to words and the use of language and integrity and honesty, and of course a different orientation to nature. But Dorsey and Narvaez did a very scholarly thing at the University of Notre Dame, where she actually compared the types of living between the United States today and small bands of gatherer hunters. And she lists things like social embeddedness, which is very low in the United States and very high in hunter-gatherers. Social support, they're the opposite. Social purposeful living, socially purposeful. Community social enjoyment, boundaries, physical contact with others, relationship with other groups, relationships, contact with other ages, role models. So she's done a lot of study about that. One of the things that might be the most helpful, just to choose one, oftentimes scholars have said, well, the indigenous worldview is a collectivist worldview, and the dominant one is an individualistic. Well, that's not really very accurate, because the hunter-gatherer, and I'm talking about the existing ones, and the worldview of pre-contact, autonomy, individual autonomy, was much stronger than it is in the dominant worldview. The difference is individuality or individualism didn't have the goal of individualism and individuality. It was so powerfully important to have autonomy and to have independent decision making, because they knew that was the best way to take care of the greater good. So it's kind of an interesting thing where, in a way, you could say that is a collective attitude, but it comes through a stronger individualism than ours does, where you have individualism for the sake of individualism, a la Donald Trump.
It really seems to me one of my favorite terms that anyone has ever introduced me to is the term of the toxic mimic, which takes the form of something and then completely turns the content upside down. So a great example of that is rape is a toxic mimic of sex, in that it will take the form and completely destroy the original intent. And there's a bazillion examples of this, and it sounds to me like the sort of libertarianism that we see in the dominant worldview would be a toxic mimic of the individuality within that larger collective.
Well, I invited Walter Block, who's an endowed professor of economics at Loyola, and he's Ron Paul's sort of economic guru. And he calls himself a Jewish atheist libertarian, but libertarianism is his mantra. And I've disagreed with everything he wrote, so I called him up and I said, would you co-author a book with me? I said, here we are, 2 university professors with these completely different ideas, but we can't debate. We can't beat each other up. We got to try to find common ground. So, your viewers can go on YouTube and put in, Block, Jacobs, social justice, and, we're at the University of St. Louis talking. And, we kind of became friends in a way, strange bedfellows that we were. But we did find some common ground. So it was an exercise that, made my wife go crazy when I would get things that he would say that I wanted to attack, but didn't. But to give you a sense of one worldview idea that we just never got close on. Something he was saying he said, if you want to really save whales, you got to privatize the oceans. And as we went on with our dialogue, you can make pens in the ocean out of electric wires, and if they need to migrate, you can put on a transducer, that kind of stuff, right? And I was blown away. But this top scholar author of many books, etc. And so I said to him, holding my patience, and said, Walter, let me try to understand this. It sounds like you're saying that only humans have intrinsic value, that nothing else on earth, from whales to trees to rivers to rocks, has intrinsic value. And I really thought that I was going to come to some common ground, and he was going to go, well, not exactly. Instead, he wrote back something to the effect, 4 arrows, I can't believe he asked me that. Of course, only humans have intrinsic value. Everything else on earth is utilitarian. Now that's a libertarian view, but it's also a capitalistic view, because with capitalistic externalities, if we started using the indigenous worldview to call rivers and animals and such our relatives and really mean it, we wouldn't be able to do what we do with quarterly profit and externalities, where we pollute and we destroy. So I really believe that it's almost a kind of religion, and that more people in our 3 Abrahamic religions, and on both sides of the political aisle, this is a dominant worldview assumption that even with the animal rights movement doesn't really get to the deeper water we swim in.
Well, it seems to me you cut to the very core of the distinction between the dominant and indigenous worldview there, with the distinction between whether others have intrinsic value or whether they are there for you to either use or to push out of your way to get at what they've got.
Right, and that goes into all kinds of cultural modalities. For example, conflict resolution. When you believe that worldview, if you look at the different conflict resolution approaches in many tribes, you see they have this common denominator where it's all about bringing people back into community. It's not about punishment or retaliation. It also expands what they call the circle of influence or blame, so that not only do community members all that are indirectly related to whatever the crime was, but there are ceremonies that actually appeal to and ask questions of the non-human world. And so, those are the kinds of things that I believe with this metacognitive tool that I introduced in Point of Departure, that everybody can begin to do in a very relatively simple way, using trans-based learning, using an indigenous orientation to fear instead of the dominant one. I'm talking about worldview, using an indigenous worldview orientation to the concept of authority, and also to the concept of words, and then to the concept of nature, and in doing that, people begin to shift in a way that educational and cultural hegemony stops guiding us.
So we're about halfway through. We're 23 minutes in, so right around 50%. And there's 2 directions I'm thinking of going, and I'm gonna ask you to choose. So would you rather talk for a couple minutes about the anti-indianism that you've mentioned, perhaps talk about that book that you blasted, or would you rather go ahead and dive right into the 4 categories, trans-based learning, etc.?
Well, I appreciate you mentioning that, because I think that until we understand that we have completely accepted an anti-Indian worldview and culture, both, and religion and paradigm and belief systems that has been orchestrated over the years. I mean, I just in the beginning of, I've written, the University of Texas published a book that I wrote called Unlearning the Language of Conquest. Scholars expose anti-Indianism in America. So there's been a lot of scholarship on this. But you can look at a number of scholars that are from Harvard and, writing things like The Invented Indian and Six Societies and, Wars Before Civilization. Almost everyone that you talk to at every level of education, come on, we know that the indigenous cultures were far more violent, that they were, far more abusive of women. far less hygiene, right? And the scholarship on
and they wiped out the buffalo too.
Yeah, on and on and on, right? But the deep scholarship, like Levitt's, showing 78% of all pre-contact cultures meet definitions that are out there for peaceful societies. So, I guess that takes a lot of work. Right, to unconvince that. So, it does get in the way. Another thing that gets in the way, Derrick, is, in my last book, where I identified 8 courses of Common Core standards, and how they are hegemonic, and that they support the status quo. And how, I'm teaching indigenous, non-indigenous people how to teach non-indigenous students. But I did a whole chapter on the sensitivity of that. Because to talk about indigenous spirituality, we've had everything else stolen from us. And that, in Sedona, some guy made $18 million doing ombleches and NEPs, vapor lodges and vision quests. And, I understand that, and we have to be sensitive to that. But more and more of my brothers believe that we're all in the same sinking boat, and that as long as we have the respect and we can come close to these deeper worldviews in common, and not pretend that we know everything about a particular culture, and be respectful and honor it. But it's a tough position that that anyone that is doing this can be in. And in fact, I'll give it away now. This thing we're organizing at the University of Notre Dame, I'm going to give a presentation and blow everybody's mind and stand up and say, I am a wannabe. Because, being a wannabe and playing Indian has always been a very pejorative idea. And most people like myself, have very little Indian compared to Irish and other things. But I want to say I do want to be an Indian if it's about worldview and saving our planet. I'm going to go in that direction. But we have to have the respect. We have to stop killing them. We have to do what we can to, stop the assassinations that are happening with dictators all over the world. And if we do that, and we understand anti-Indianism, then we can move into what is a legacy for all of us, and that is our worldview that is indigenous to this planet.
So before we dive into that, I have a couple things. One of them is, first, why the anti-Indianism? What central function does that serve in perpetuating the dominant worldview?
Well, it did 2 things. The first that it did is that it gave a counterpoint to all that was being done under the papal bulls and the doctrine of discovery. In other words, it gave a rationale for taking land and killing people and conquering. So, that was the beginning of it. And that's embedded now in several, the United States of America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. That's embedded in our Constitution. All of those kinds of things, right? And so, that is part of it. Another part of it was, as it became more and more negative, it made these ways of the dominant culture more and more positive. That we are in this myth of progress, and so. Just recently, you heard, both. Whether it be Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, or both of them have said anti-Indian things and have done anti-Indian things. Right? It's just built into our system, and romanticizing the Indian is another form of anti-Indianism. It has been strong in that it allows the dominant culture to continue to seem legitimate.
Well, actually, that reminds me of another thing. Can you go on for a second then about contrasting honest looks at the indigenous worldview with the sort of noble, savage, innocent, childlike? They have no culture. They have no language. They just act freely, and there is no. They have no inhibitions with that, and very quickly talk about the role of that in the how that plays out in the anti-Indian worldview.
Well, a lot of people will recognize, people who are intelligent recognize that there are these good things that they see, and Rousseau's kind of idea of the noble savage, and Emerson and Thoreau. Thoreau, most of it, people don't know this, but most of Thoreau's stuff came from his love of the philosophy of American Indians. And so it's sort of like, some of it starts out sincere, other of it is like kind of throwing a bone. Some of it is just an effort to kind of stand against the horrors of the dominant hierarchical culture. So it's really a complexity of those things. But the bottom line is, when even positive statements of the noble savage are invoked, that is as hurtful as the anti-Indianism. But the reasons for it, to answer your question, really come from good intentions and bad intentions, so it's a real complexity. And it was hard for me to understand how these two historical biographers that wrote this book on Red Cloud, that won so many accolades, how not a single person could not get past that, because the only places where he said positive things were kind of what you're saying. They were romanticizing, but the way it was done, in contrast with a lot of inaccuracies, calling a matriarchy, a patriarchy, etc., just shows how deeply embedded this is in our culture.
It seems to me that one of the great harms that is done by the noble savage myth is that it makes it an inherent state as opposed to things that are taught. So if they're just naturally uninhibited, they don't have a language that teaches them how to be good, and they don't have cultural teachings that teach them how to be good. I'm thinking of, my mom buys firewood from some Klamath Indians, and they come up and they deliver it. And this year, when they delivered it, then my mom has developed a relationship with them over the year. The woman brought her niece, I believe, who is 15, and was so proud to show off pictures of the dress that her grandmother made for her for the brush dances. The dress, by the way, weighs 50 pounds, and it's extraordinarily beautiful. And the point of me bringing all this up is that when she said thank you to her grandmother said to her, the way you can thank me is by living a good life. And right. That just seems to, I love that story, and that seems to be just, she said it immediately, and that's how you raise a great grandchild, it seems to me.
That's right. And this idea of, I'm always at risk at this, because this is what I do. This is what I've done for the last 20 years, is promote Indigenous worldview, and I'm always at risk initially of romanticizing the Indigenous. Oftentimes, Derrick, I'll start out with a joke. I'll say, there were these two cavalry guys, white guys, who really had started to realize how mystical the Indians were. And they came around a bend, and sure enough, there was this Indian laying on his on the road with his ear to the road, listening. And one cavalry guy said to the other, "See what I mean? You just wait to see what this guy can learn from listening to the road." So they waited a few minutes, and then finally, the one guy said, "So, Indian, what do you see?" An Indian said, "Well, I see a roan horse, a flaxen mane and tail. I see a pinto horse pulling a coach, a young white woman with red hair, with baby, maybe 2 years old, is sitting in the passenger seat. Her father, with gray beard, is driving." And, of course, the second cavalry guy went, "Oh, my God, you're right. How do they know that?" And one guy said, "Well, how do you know that?" He says, "They just ran over me." So,
right. Yeah.
So just to try to get away from that. We know that that human beings have the same inner potentialities. It's about whether or not you're following the laws of nature. And maybe just this is old hat for you, but maybe not for some of your audience. Even Darwin in his Descent of Man said, look, I'm going to talk about something special in this competitive evolutionary phenomenon. But I got to tell you, from my observations, the main theme in the world of nature is mutual aid.
Yep.
And then Kropotkin wrote a book on that later, right? But everybody else went into neo-Darwinism and took that for a ride, right? Which we still have. But so it's really about a nature-based observation. When Greg Kaheti and I wrote the book on critical neurophilosophy, we thought it was because everybody was into neuroscience, we thought, wow, we'll be able to get these concepts of the indigenous worldview like generosity and honesty and these kinds of all of these things. We thought that it would sell it, but it was just the opposite. It was just the opposite. The worldview that these neuroscientists were going through, where what they were doing is they were saying things like, well, because a part of the brain that we know, selfishness, lights up, and when we give monopoly money to people and they give it away, it also lights up. Therefore, generosity really is just a self-serving thing, right? Well, if you look at study animals, you know that there are animals that save another person without ever having any species benefit, right? And so, it goes on.
There's a great example of that I just love, which is that, plants, if they start to get chewed on by a caterpillar, they will send out chemical messages. They will communicate to other plants, hey, there's a caterpillar chewing on me. You better change your leaf composition to make it toxic or to make it unpalatable or something. And there's these two scientists who are studying plant communication this way, but they don't call it plant communication because they say, why would a plant spend energy cluing in their competitors to a threat? And I read that and I just completely flipped out and said, let's change one word, which is, why would a plant clue in their neighbors as opposed to competitors that there was a threat? And that's the answer to everything. It's because they recognize that a forest is more than just alder trees. They recognize that they're helping out their friends is what they're doing. But the scientists, even though they actually see the information, they are so stuck in this competitive worldview, in this selfish gene worldview, that they can't conceptualize the notion that somebody would actually help their neighbor.
You got it, my brother. And that's so we're not talking about different people, better people. This is not a chosen people idea at all. My indigenous brothers and sisters can be just as stupid, mean, angry, or whatever as anybody else, and just as subject to being misguided or whatever, alcoholism, you name it. But when we are able to live according to a worldview that small pockets of people still do, that is based on the mores that were learned from nature and not developed in behalf of materialism. I keep hearing a kind of a noise, Derek. I don't know if that's going to show up on our thing, but it sounded like a paper dragging. Anyway, so I think that that once we understand that this is something that we can begin to do by understanding that, and I'll just briefly introduce what I describe in the book, that once we understand that how indigenous people learned, they understood that the main form of cognition wasn't sufficient to deeply implant what it took to be able to walk a path of generosity and honesty and courage and patience and fortitude, etc. So they did all kinds of things without knowing, terminology or caring about terminology relating to self-hypnosis or hypnosis or trance or whatever. So they did chanting, they did dancing, they did singing, they did vision quests, they did sometimes plant medicine, etc. And we can learn to do that so simply. The information on self-hypnosis that I teach in the book is so simple to do. And yet it's one of those things that most of the religions are against it. Schools don't allow it. And yet it's natural. It's totally natural. And so we talk about how to use trance-based learning to really understand why you do what you do when what you do is not doing well. And that's based on what I call fear, authority, words, and nature. And that is indigenous cultures see, once the fight or flight mechanism of fear is over, they see fear as an opportunity to practice a virtue. And that's very different from the dominant worldview that avoids fear and a catalyst for fear at all costs. The second thing is authority. In a dominant culture, authority comes from my father, from my priest, from my policeman, from my, you name it. It's external. And indigenous cultures, and we know this from a lot of research with this, especially with the non-hierarchical or reverse dominance, that it was reflection on lived experience, honest reflection on lived experience with the awareness that everything is connected. And that complementarity can be found in most things. Then that moves us to, I write a chapter on each one of these. That moves us to words. We know in the dominant culture that words have become all about deception. There's been a number of books and movies out, Why We Lie, that show that neuroscientists say that this is a defense mechanism. Baloney. Okay, it's a defense mechanism when you trust the other guy, right? And you know what he's going to say. There's some good books out there, like A Time Before Deception, that show this in a scholarly way. And then the last one, of course, is nature, the role of nature as guide, the law, the teacher, etc.
So we have 5 or 6 minutes left, and what I would like to do, since we emphasize so much the different worldviews, I think you laid a wonderful basis for that. But I think we've given short shrift to those 4 categories. So if you'd like, what I would like to do is to do another interview sometime in the next few weeks where we basically accept this interview as the starting point, and then we move from there to give 10 minutes on each of those different categories. Would that be okay?
Well, we could do that, and of course, I just made a deal with my publisher because I couldn't believe that they were asking $49. So they reduced it down to $24, and they said anybody that's watching this your show, if they just go to the Information Age Publishing, they can order Point of Departure and get it for $24. But so they can. I write it. I don't, like I say, I'm not using an academic approach to this. I try to teach it as clearly, as simply as I can. But Derrick, I always enjoy talking with you, and we can talk about that or any other number of subjects. I think that without talking to each other in 2 years, we're moving in the same wavelength.
Well, thank you, and I think that each one of those categories that you talked about, the trance-based learning, the courage, I think each one of those obviously deserves a lifetime of study, but it also deserves more time than we can do to it today. But having said that, I'm wondering, when you were talking about courage and fearlessness, I'm thinking, my own perspective on how the dominant culture started. This is just making stuff up because it was 7,000 years ago, so who knows. But my perspective on that is I've always sort of wondered if I perceive the dominant culture as being so traumatizing on every level that we have an entire culture that has based its philosophies on post-traumatic stress disorder, and that everybody is traumatized. So my perspective on how this began, which once again, just making stuff up, is that you had some community, maybe even just as small as a family, that ended up getting really traumatized, but for whatever reason, that particular family did not have the communal tools to work through their trauma, and so they instead started to develop a worldview that was based on the notion that they'd been traumatized. And unrealized trauma, and so then they ended up becoming very fearful. They ended up becoming very hostile. They ended up becoming all those things that very easily triggered by fear. And I was thinking about that because of what you said about the different perspectives on courage and fearlessness, and I love what you said about that. Can you talk about that for a couple minutes?
Well, I think you're on to something. It was a coincidence that I brought my grandson, who just turned 16 and graduated from UC Berkeley, and I took him on his first Sundance with a Cree up here, and it's really amazing that the guy that was there is a guy named Bruce Lipton, who wrote a book called Biology of Belief, because he's totally into the indigenous. So we became friends. He wasn't a Sundancer, but he was there supporting the Sundancers. And in his book, and he is, in sort of a layman's terms, talking about the field of epigenetics. And epigenetics is saying exactly what you're saying. In fact, I just had one of my doctoral students, a Cherokee lady, did a dissertation on historical trauma, in which she found 7 generations of people were affected by boarding school experiences. Even people that have absolutely no oppression now. And so I think this field of epigenetics I know one of the studies, and don't quote me, but one of the studies on schizophrenia showed that a statistically significant number of people with schizophrenia had either a mother, a father, a grandfather, a grandmother, or a great-grandparent who had sexually abused one of the children. So a high correlation, right? So I think this is one of those subjects that the research is just starting. Does it go back, as far as back as we're talking? Well, why not? Why not? So I think it's a fascinating idea. But epigenetic also shows us that you can change it literally in one lifetime or in one hypnotic session. You can have cellular genetic cells that lead you into one particular direction, but the DNA driver of it is what can change. So that's why my metacognitive tool, I believe, can change the historical traumas that probably have done pretty much what you're saying.
So like I said, thank you for that. And I would love to talk to you again about 10 minutes on each of those. But for now, we've got like 2 minutes left. Can you sort of sum up what you would want? What do you want from your book, and what do you want for readers of your book? Why did you write it? What's the point? What is your hope in terms of both what this does for individuals and what this does for society at large? What would be your ideal dream on that?
I believe that we're not going to be able to address our social ecological injustices, our lack of sustainability, our disrespect for diversity, and our continuing and growing violence with any of the tools, no matter how well intended people are, that we are using in the dominant culture. As long as deeply rooted under our efforts are some of these basic understandings about fear, authority, words, and nature, and the phenomenon of trance-based learning. And that the only way that we're going to wake up and be able to be our own person, to have our own light shine in ways that understand our true interconnectedness, is to begin to reflect on problems and challenges we have from a worldview perspective, change them with some trance-based learning, which is something that you can do with a string and paperclip, to change into a different brainwave frequency that will allow the autonomic nervous system function to reprogram, if you will. So that's what I'm hoping will happen with this book, that people will really begin to have groups where they use the tool to help each other address the challenges in their personal lives and in their corporate lives and in their communities, by saying, well, what would it look like if we believed such and such?
Well, that's all really fantastic, and thank you so much for writing this book. And I would like to thank listeners for listening. My guest today has been Four Arrows. This is Derrick Jensen for Resistance Radio on the Progressive Radio Network.